Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on conclusion, inference, and must be true questions. Now, you guys may remember from our earlier sessions that a conclusion is also a kind of inference. These are basically the same thing. Now, there could be some small differences, and we'll take a look at those very soon. Let's start with our task in these questions. I think the real task with conclusion and inference questions, a lot of it is around discipline. How well we can understand the information that's given to us and how much information has been given to us, its limits. But first of all, let's make sure that we're all on the same page on this. An inference and a conclusion are very similar, right? So, in fact, a conclusion would be an inference. And an inference is something where you take the information that has been given to you and you derive something from that information. And that's basically what a conclusion is as well. That's our task in these questions. So, an inference is a statement derived from at least one of the given statements. Now, this is a point we've discussed briefly, but we want to take a deeper look at this one. Is a conclusion exactly the same as an inference? So, for example, if your question asks you for a conclusion, is that exactly the same thing as an inference question? Let me have your thoughts. Whenever you're ready, please unmute and let me know.
Yeah, that is same. I think conclusion and inference.
Right. So, basically, you derive a conclusion, right? Just like you derive an inference. So, yeah, I'd say that they're very similar. But I'm open to different ways of looking at it. In fact, I think Karthik also has a point to make. Please go ahead, Karthik.
So, Ajitesh, when I say conclusion, either it can be, simply stated and it can be directly derived. And if I have to make an inference, it involves, a step or two in order to reach to that very state where I can exactly infer what is being stated.
So, when you say a step or two, do you mean that an inference involves multiple steps?
Means it's not directly stated. You have to, in a way, reach to that using some logic or some step.
Fair enough. Now, there are questions that ask you to identify the conclusion, like, okay, which statement is the conclusion, right? Have you seen any questions like that?
Yes.
Okay, right. That's actually a point I want to quickly address before coming back to your question. So, there are questions that ask you to directly identify the conclusion, right? And of course, in bold-faced questions, we've already seen that sometimes you have to identify inferences, sometimes you have to identify conclusions, and sometimes you have to identify, support statements. So, literally any part of an argument. Just so that all of us are on the same page on this, we're working on slightly different questions today. Questions where we're basically trying to derive something from the information that has been given to us. So, this is slightly different from structure questions where we're just identifying parts of an argument. Now, as for your point about steps, I probably wouldn't look at that as a difference between conclusion and inference. The specific point that I want to discuss is that maybe a conclusion is more like a final point of whatever has been given to us. Now, let's take a step back and think about what we see in the stimulus. Basically, we can see one of two things: an argument or a set of statements. If we see an argument, that means we'll see at least one inference because an argument will have a conclusion. Keep this in mind because some people say that a conclusion or inference question won't already have a conclusion or inference. I just don't see any reason for us to limit ourselves that way. The second possibility is that we'll see a set of statements where we don't already have an inference or conclusion. Now, one way of looking at this is that a conclusion is like the final point. And that's actually correct. And definitely, it's very important to make similar distinctions in structure questions for sure. But just from a practical perspective, I think that in conclusion slash inference questions, we should try not to differentiate too much between, conclusions and inferences. But what we want to do here is we want to make sure that you guys have the best information possible. So this will be a little clearer with an example. Okay, let's say that there are three siblings, A, B, and C. Now, the eldest has to clean the dishes after dinner. Now we bring in another premise. So we say that A is the eldest. Okay, so the setup is quite straightforward. Now the conclusion is going to look something like this. A has to clean the dishes after dinner. Now, don't get me wrong, this is an inference as well, right? But a pure inference that's not a conclusion might look something like this. A is older than B, or A is older than C. Now, we can definitely draw these inferences, right? Because we know that these three are siblings and A is the eldest. So we can definitely draw these inferences from the information we've been given. But it just feels that these inferences are a little random. It doesn't feel like the entire argument was building up to the conclusion that A is older than B, right? So if you look at either of these, it's not like we're trying to say, oh, there are three siblings, the eldest has to clean dishes, A is the eldest, and therefore A is older than B. So it's not as if the entire argument was built to, convince us that A is older than B. Whereas if we look at this particular statement, that A has to clean the dishes, that's something that seems to follow from, these statements. So that would be the difference between a conclusion and an inference. Okay, so why am I asking you not to differentiate between these? There are two reasons. Basically, I don't think the GMAT will give you two options in the same question that are both inferable and then ask you which one is a conclusion or which one is only an inference but not a conclusion. The second reason is, the GMAT is just an exam. One of the main points about my approach to exams, like to SC on the previous GMAT and CR and RC generally, is that I don't expect too much from these exams. I don't think they're perfect, and my mindset going into these exams is more like, just let me figure out what they're looking for and just give it to them, and then move on to the next question. Now, just to be clear, I'm not imposing a particular approach on you. You're welcome to think this over and just see what works for you. All I'm saying is that from a practical perspective, it's probably best to just think that conclusion and inference questions are basically the same thing. The next point is definitely a little controversial. A lot of people think that, okay, look, I have a conclusion question in front of me, right? The question is asking me, the given statements support or most strongly support which of the following conclusions? Now, over here, do you think that we have to go for a situation where the correct answer absolutely must be true according to the information that has been given to us? Or do you think it's possible that the correct option maybe is not quite that watertight? Let me have your thoughts. Okay, so we have some points. It must be within the scope of the argument, can't be that stringent. And Kush is saying agreed with Karthik. Fair enough. So again, this is one of those situations where different people have different points of view. Some people think that we need to hold the correct option in a conclusion/inference question to a very high standard. And I'd have to say that in most cases, they are right. But if you solve enough GMAT questions, you will find that there are conclusion/inference questions in which the correct option is not that watertight, right? So you may be able to find a few weaknesses even in the correct option. But at the same time, just remember your task in verbal. Your task is to find the best of the five options, right? The five options given to you. So, over here, again, just purely from a practical perspective, I'd ask you to keep an open mind and try your best to work within the information that has been given to you. But in case you feel that, yeah, I've reliably removed four options, they're definitely wrong. But the one that I'm left with, it's not 100%, but yeah, I think I can kind of get to it, right? I want you to be open to that. I want you to be open to marking an option like that. Also, remember that if you feel that something like that is happening, you can use elimination. So, first, try to remove the other options so that you're left with the option that you're not completely sure about. Quick check, is everyone agreed with this? I'm just asking because this is something that a lot of people have very strong opinions on. Okay, I've received a few yeses for this. Kush, please go ahead.
So Ajitesh, I attended this class of some tutor, and that guy said for the inference questions, the answer should not be directly stated. within the para or something. Is that a correct way to approach?
That's a good point. Now, this seems, to me, to be like one of those not very useful points that people sometimes discuss. Let me think about it, but my guess would be that if you see a statement, right, that's exactly the same as one of the premises. Mm, so, what I'm trying to do right now is I'm just trying to remember whether I've seen anything like that before. My guess would be that GMAT would probably not. I don't think the GMAT would give you something that easy. But if you see something that's literally exactly the same as one of the premises, how would you say that that is not correct? If somebody asks you, can you infer that? And the reason I'm saying this is imagine that one of the premises says something, right? And one of the options says pretty much the same thing, but like in a slightly different way. The question says, can you infer that statement from the first statement? Is it possible to say that that's incorrect only because we're saying that it's a restatement of the given information? I would I would hesitate to remove that. But again, over here, this discussion is becoming a little speculative because we don't know or we don't have questions in which maybe the GMAT has done this. So, what I would suggest to you, Kush, is that if you come across a question that does this, that actually gives you an option that's a direct restatement of one of the premises, and then removes that option just because it's a restatement, I think let's take a look at that sometime and use that to inform our approach. Quick check, Kush. Does that make sense? Absolutely. So let's bottom line this. If you get a statement that's a direct restatement of one of the premises, keep an open mind. Don't remove it immediately. Look at your other options and then see whether you're going to mark that option or not. But frankly speaking, I don't think this is going to be a very common scenario on the GMAT. Okay, now to summarize what we discussed before this, our approach is to try to work within the given information. And this is what we will do for conclusion questions, for inference questions generally. But then there are these must be true questions. And literally, the question stem will say something like must be true. So if you see an inference question that is a must be true question, you have to work with only the given information. So, no chance over here of bringing in outside information. We must be able to get to the correct option using only the information that we have. So, basically, in must be true questions, we have to be absolutely very strict. Okay, quick check. Is everyone comfortable with this? Must be true needs us to work with only the given information. Okay, excellent. Now, one of the things about inference questions is that simple looking options may be correct. So, a lot of times, what I find is students look at an option and they're like, yeah, I get that. And it seems a little too easy, right? So, what we're saying is, even if it looks a little straightforward, you may just have to mark it. So, I want you to keep this in mind. I'm not trying to say that all inference questions are easy. I'm just saying that sometimes the correct option looks simple. Don't be afraid of marking an option that looks straightforward. Again, remember that you can always rely on elimination, but sometimes, depending on your strengths and weaknesses, particular context that you see in the question, you might just find that the correct option looks just super straightforward. Right. So, one more point. Do you remember we discussed that a relationship like this, if A, then B, right? If A is true, then B is true. So, in a relationship like this, if you flip it, if you reverse this, you get if B, then A. If B is true, then A is true. Now, obviously, the second one is a logical error, right? But if you take the inverse of the statement, so if you take if not B, then not A, you're going to find that some options may look like this inference. So let me just take a step back over here. If you see that the information that's given to you is like if A, then B, or maybe it leads to an inference that looks like this, then maybe the correct option won't be in that form. It may be in the form if not B, then not A. Just to be clear, let's call this statement 1 and let's call this statement 2. If statement 1 is correct, then statement 2 has to be correct, right? So the correct option may not be in the form that you see in statement 1. It may be in the form that you see in statement 2. It may be a little unexpected, but effectively we're looking at an equivalent situation. So statement 2 could be the correct option if you were expecting statement 1 to be the correct option. Okay, quick check. Is everyone comfortable with this? Okay, I've received a couple of yeses on this. How about the rest of us? Okay, I've received one more yes. Okay, fine. Okay, cool. Everyone's confirmed. Now let's move on to a few common errors or common mistakes in options that we may see. First of all, some options are just going to be completely random, right? They'll come up with weird statements that absolutely don't follow, and these will be completely unpredictable. So, completely unpredictable statements that just don't follow from the information that you have. If you try to put the information that you have together, you'll find that, oops, there's no way to get to this statement. Another one is a statement that's way too broad in scope. So let me give you an example. I remember there was this question. So there was this question that I really liked. It was about overfishing or something. And then one of the options said that technology is the reason for the encroachment on nature by humans or something like that. So what they had done is that they'd started off with something like fishing along with cutting trees or something, basically something specific. And one of the options had said something like technology is the reason for the encroachment on nature, like all of nature. So that was way too broad because we started off with, I mean, we had information only about fishing and trees. So that's another type of incorrect option that you might find. A statement that just broadens the scope too much beyond what we can get from the information that we have. So again, it won't follow from the information that we have because it just expands a bit too much. Another type of incorrect option is okay, look, I've got a statement that I can infer, right? Or I've got a piece of information in the stimulus. And one of the options that I see is the direct opposite of that. So that could be another wrong option in a conclusion slash inference question. Now, these are things that we've discussed before. So let's do a quick recap. If we say something like this, if A, then B, and this is something that you feel you can infer, like I'd be happy marking this. But then you see an option that says something like this, if B, then A. So if B is true, then A is true. This is a problem, right? So this will not be correct in a must be true sort of situation. We'll need additional information to say that if B is true, then A is true is definitely correct. So watch out for this. And of course, the other fallacy over here is if somebody says, look, A is not true, so B is not true. So A is not true, and that means that B is not true. This is another issue. So again, in a must be true question, we can't say this. Quick check. Is everyone comfortable with this? All right. I think I've received a few yeses on this. Perfect.
So Ajitesh, do we need to remember all these, rules for this kind of questions? For example, if it's unpredictable or if it's too broad, whatever the situations you have mentioned, do we need to remember this particular options so that we can use this technique to solve those questions?
That's a very, very good question. And let me try to explain it using a slightly different example. Amit, have you studied sentence correction? Let me know. Yes, no on this.
No, not really.
Oh, you've not done sentence correction, right?
No.
Okay, so the thing with sentence correction is that there are a lot of rules. Now, in sentence correction, if you know those rules, that's a very good thing. But here's the thing, if you know those rules, but you haven't completely internalized them, those rules will become a liability. And let me just quickly explain this. Let's say there are two people, right? The first person knows all the rules and is very comfortable with them. He or she doesn't have to actively think about those rules, those patterns, right? When that person gets an SC question, their approach is typically going to be very fast, very efficient. But if we have another person, again, he or she knows the rules, but hasn't really practiced them, right? It's not like the rules are on their fingertips. That person, if they try to apply the rules on the day of the exam, they're probably going to run out of time. So if you have certain ideas, certain expectations, right? Certain knowledge of the questions, the correct options, the incorrect options, the kind of patterns that you'll see, it's good. I'm not saying that it's not good. You should have that. But if you're going to be looking for those patterns actively on the day of the exam, as in you say that, okay, look, this is a strengthened question. Now I'm going to look for this sort of thing. Then I'm going to look for this sort of thing. I think that could be a problem. I'm not fully sure I've explained myself properly, but Amit, does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, Ajitesh, thank you.
Perfect. Of course, I was answering your question in a more general way. In the case of these inference or conclusion questions, what you're going to find is that these questions are super rare, right? So, in your entire official guide, right? Like, I'm talking about the latest official guide, you might find maybe 9, 10 questions, inference questions. And to be clear, I'm including everything: conclusion, inference, must be true, everything. So everything put together is going to be maybe 9 to 10 questions in your entire official guide. So this entire question type is not super common. We should be ready for it. But let's keep in mind that strengthen, weaken, and assumption, those are the big ones. After that, you get conclusion, and after that, you get evaluate and paradox. And very rarely you'll get something like method of reasoning. So, in the case of inference slash conclusion questions, especially, right, you're going to find that maybe it's not a good idea to try to remember too many things, especially if you find that when you're solving these questions, when you see the correct option, it usually just hits you and you anyway see the pattern. All right, everyone, we're now ready to move on to our first question. You have 2.5 minutes. Please go ahead. All right, guys, that's time. First of all, let me give you the correct answer. If I remember correctly, the correct answer is C. C for Charlie. Now, quick check. Can anyone just quickly confirm this? Give me a yes if C is the correct answer. Okay, excellent. I've got a few yeses on this. Now, before we move on to these five options, right, and we will take a look at all these five options, I want a good summary of the information that we have, because if we don't fully get the information that's been given to us, it's very likely that we'll make a mistake in these inference conclusion questions. Anyone who's ready with that to summarize the information or the understanding that you've got from the stimulus?
So Ajitesh, may I try?
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
So the paragraph states that the humans get Lyme disease from the ticks who are infected. Now, from where do the ticks get this very bacteria or the microorganism which infects? They get it from feeding on animals who have Lyme disease. So they are basically the transmitters. They get this Lyme disease from the host animal and then they transfer it to the humans. Now it goes on to say is that transmission from the host animal to the ticks is very rare. It does not happen readily. But there is an exception to it, and that exception is the mice, white-footed mice. And it goes on to say that wherever white-footed mouse populations are very high, they expand, and that only happens where the biodiversity is in decline, meaning the other uh, animals or the other insects or other such kind of organisms are in decline. So the only reason ticks have to like feed themselves on white-footed mouse is because other biodiversity or the other organisms are not available to them.
So your summary is very good, but I think towards the end, you use the word only somewhere. So towards the end, I think you use the word only a couple of times. For example, I think you said something like the white footed mouse population expands only when biodiversity is in decline.
No, I what I stated was that the only reason they have to feed on white-footed mouse is because the other hosts are not readily available. Means the biodiversity is not that rich, so they have no other option except to feed themselves on white-footed mouse.
Okay, got it. So again, you're on the right track, but remember the stimulus just says becoming the main food source for ticks, right?
Right, I got that
So
point. I shouldn't be using only here.
exactly. So when we read the stimulus, if we kind of switch the words around a little bit, then our expectations of the correct option, right, that could change. Okay, but this is a very good summary of the information that we have. Now let's take a look at the question stem. The information in the passage most strongly supports which of the following? Now, one of the reasons that I like to start with this question, and to be clear, what we're doing is we're doing a couple of medium difficulty questions, and then we'll move on to the high difficulty questions. Okay, so the stem over here is one of the reasons I like to discuss this question. Now, the stem says the information in the passage most strongly supports which of the following? I just want to take a second to make sure that everyone's on the same page over here. We've got this phrase, most strongly supports. Now, support is a word that you typically find in strengthened questions, right? And strengthened questions are far more common. So, this is something that sometimes confuses test takers. Now, the stem says the given information most strongly supports X, where X is the correct option. So, if you look at it like this, you've got the stimulus, which they are calling a passage. And they're saying the information in this passage most strongly supports which of the following options. Now, of course, the GMAT's not actually going to call these options A, B, C, D, E, but the point is the question is asking us to use the information that's been given to get to something, and that something is going to be the correct option. So, this is definitely an inference question, right? Now, let's be absolutely sure that this is not a strengthened question. A strengthened question will say something like, which of the following options most strongly supports So, which of these options most strongly supports, let's say, the author's conclusion? So, over there, the arrow is sort of pointing in the opposite direction. Quick check, are we comfortable with the difference between these two question types?
Can you please repeat?
Right, Amit. So, if you're given some information in the stimulus, right, and the question says that information that you've been given most strongly supports the correct option, that's an inference question. But if the question says the option most strongly supports something, that's a strengthen question. Amit, can I have a quick yes on that?
Yes.
Perfect. The other thing that I want you guys to look at is how the stem says most strongly. This is important for us because it tells us that we're not looking at a must be true question. So, again, in a must be true question, they will literally say must be true. But what this question wants from us is going to involve some kind of probability. So, we're not necessarily looking for certainty over here. Okay, so let's keep those two things in mind. Firstly, we're looking at an inference question. And secondly, the correct option just needs to be most strongly supported out of the 5 given options. All right, guys, let's move on to the first option. In areas where many humans are infected with Lyme disease, the proportion of ticks infected with Lyme disease is especially high. Now, in this case, they're talking about the proportion of ticks infected with Lyme disease, right? So, can we get to this information? Okay, so I've got a couple of no's on this. Why? What are we missing? What information do we not have? Think about it. In order to get to a statement about the proportion of infected ticks, what other information would we need?
Ajitesh, can it be like we need a higher proportion of ticks to have like a higher proportion of humans infected, something like that?
I don't think the information supports that, but my question is slightly different. My question is just about the proportion of ticks. Just to get to that, just the proportion, what information do we need? And I see that Simran has raised her hand. Simran, please go ahead.
So the question does not say anything about the ease of transmission of the Lyme disease from ticks to humans. It just says that humans get Lyme disease from infected ticks. So I think the proportion can sort of be inferred if we have that information as to the ease with which it gets transmitted.
I would have to say that even with the ease of transmission, we probably can't get to this. So, at a basic level, what we would need is the number of ticks. Do you agree? To get to the proportion of infected ticks somewhere, we would need the total number of ticks and the number of infected ticks or the number of uninfected ticks,
Right.
right? Then only we'll get the proportion of infected ticks. Like if you have a certain number of ticks that are infected and then you have the total population of ticks, then we could get to something like this. But we have absolutely no information about how many ticks there are. And just keep in mind that option A isn't even restricted to areas where biodiversity is in decline.
Right.
So we have no idea whether the white footed mouse population has even gone up or not. So, no information about the WFM population, about the tick population. So, there's absolutely no way that we're going to be able to get to option A. Quick check, is everyone comfortable with this? Okay, good. Now let's move on to the second option. Very few animals that live in areas where there are no white footed mice are infected with Lyme disease. Now, this one is very, very random, right? But okay, hang on. Let me draw this out. We've got host animals that pass Lyme disease to ticks, and white footed mice are like an example of host animal. That's part of the information that we have. Option B is saying that very few animals that live in areas where there are no white footed mice are infected with Lyme disease. But the problem is that these animals, I mean, in the question, the information that we have doesn't tell us where these animals get Lyme disease from. So, white footed mice, they are a host animal that passes Lyme disease to ticks. But are the white footed mice are they the ones passing Lyme disease on to the other host animals? We literally have no idea. Quick check, is everyone comfortable with why B is out? Okay, good. I've received a few yeses on this. Now we get to the right answer. Humans are less at risk of contracting Lyme disease in areas where biodiversity is high. How do we get to C?
So let me give it a try.
Absolutely.
So basically, when you have high biodiversity, the ticks can feed on other animals that are not white-footed rats, right? And the probability of ticks getting infected with Lyme disease decreases significantly, and as a result, they can't pass it on to humans as well.
Right. The only thing I'll change over there is the word can't, right?
Okay, yeah.
So we want to be very careful in these. Remember the thing we discussed about being very disciplined, right? That's the most important thing in these inference or conclusion questions. Be very, very disciplined with how you are, interpreting the information that has been given to you. It's very, very important in these questions. But the point that Kush has made is absolutely valid. So the question said something about, when biodiversity declines, then the white footed mouse population goes up. And then these white footed mice become the main food source for the ticks or something like that. So if we think about when the problem in the question starts, it really starts with a decline in biodiversity. So when that particular condition becomes true, that biodiversity is in decline, that's when all of this white-footed mouse population goes up and ticks start feeding mainly on white-footed mice. But if we look at option C is not saying that these are areas where biodiversity is in decline. Option C is talking about areas where biodiversity is high. So in these kinds of areas, we would, there are two possibilities. Either the biodiversity decline is not happening, or these areas where biodiversity is high, even if the biodiversity is declining, these areas would be in a better position to deal with that. So, to summarize it, these kinds of areas either don't have the declining biodiversity problem or they're just better placed to deal with it. All in all, it's probably easier for us to say that humans are less at risk of contracting Lyme disease in areas where biodiversity is high. Quick check, can I have a yes on this? If everyone's comfortable. Or, of course, please unmute and ask your questions. Okay, I've got a couple of yeses. And now we've got more yeses. Perfect. Now, there's one option that I really want to discuss. If I remember, that's E. Option E for echo. But first, let's take a look at D for delta. Ticks feed on white footed mice only when other host species are not available to them. Okay, who'd like to take this one? Simran, please go ahead.
So the passage reads that where white-footed mouse populations greatly expand, they become the main food sources. It does not say that it's the only food source, and hence D is not the right option.
Excellent. So it doesn't say that they're the only food source. And secondly, option D seems to be introducing, almost like a preference for these ticks, right? It says ticks feed on white footed mice only when other host species are not available. Almost as if, they have a preference for the other host animals or species. And again, that information has just not been given to us. So all we know is that when biodiversity is declining, right, then what happens? The white footed mouse population goes up. And these things then become the main food source for ticks at that point. But there's nothing that implies any sort of preference over here. So this is not the correct option. Okay, so now we've reached the option that I wanted to discuss, E. Please take your time. I'd like this one to come from your side. When you're ready, please tell me why E is wrong. Kush, please go ahead.
So I would interpret it as any given host, the probability of passing the Lyme disease to ticks by any given host animal does not really depend upon the biodiversity of an area, right? Because I mean, that's an individual animal, so it just depends upon the biological characteristics of that animal and not the biodiversity of the area.
And why do you say that? Try to go one step deeper.
Okay, I
Okay, no problem. Think about it. You can get back to me. Simran, I see you've raised your hand. Please go ahead.
So the passage reads that white-footed mice are an exception and they readily pass the Lyme disease to ticks. So I don't think it's correct to say that any given host animal in that area can pass Lyme disease to ticks because we don't know how easily it can be passed on to ticks.
Very good. I see that Amit and Shohini have raised their hands. Amit, please go ahead.
So it says the greater the biodiversity of an area, the more likely any given host animal in that area is to pass Lyme diseases to ticks, right? So if it does not mean if that the biodiversity is greater, right, the particular animal which would be passing the Lyme disease would be greater in that area. It might be that the particular animal or the number of animals which are present in the biodiversity which passes this particular disease are less. So we cannot conclude this.
I think you're on the right track. Shohini also raised her hand. Please go ahead, Shohini.
Hi, Ajitesh. So basically, which I wanted to say that in the question stem, they mentioned that among all of the host animals, only white-footed mice has the most highest probability to transmit the disease to the ticks, right? But in
Mhm.
the answer, it is saying that if the biodiversity increase, that any animal will increase, have the higher probability to give it to the ticks. So this is not in line with what are the statements given.
Fair enough. That is correct. So this is not coming from the statements that we have. And I think you guys were absolutely on the right track. So, just to be clear, the information that we have has nothing to do with biodiversity and the probability of transmission from other host animals to ticks. The only connection we have is between a decline in biodiversity and the white footed mouse population. Quick check, is everyone comfortable with this? Excellent. All right, we're ready to move on to the next question. Please go ahead. Okay, that's 2.5 minutes. First of all, please check your answers. If I remember correctly, the correct answer is D, D for Delta. And in this question, I think a lot of people get stuck between C and D. So that's the third and fourth options. What I would like from you guys is for someone to tell me why D is correct and why C is wrong. Shohini, I see that you've raised your hand. Are you looking to answer this question?
No, no, I forgot to like switch it
Okay,
off.
okay, no problem. No problem. Now, just before we get going, take a look at the stem. If the statements above are true, which of the following must be true? This is one of those must be true questions that we were discussing right at the beginning. The correct option over here must follow from the information that we have. So let's keep that in mind. We have to be a lot more strict with what we're going to mark in this question. All right, whenever you guys are ready.
So, Ajitesh, it may be the case that so I am answering the part where I can see why C is wrong. So, the point is that it may be the case that people who traveled by air traveled like for around 10,000 miles and the ticket prices were around 10,000 rupees. So, it ultimately it costed them 1 rupee per mile. Whereas if they traveled by road or other means of transport, the miles traveled were less, but the cost was around, say, 5,000 rupees. So that cannot be inferred straight away. Means we cannot infer it for sure.
Yes, very good. So let's go back to the stimulus. Let's summarize the information that we have. What we're told is that transportation expenses accounted for a large portion of the total dollar amount spent on trips for pleasure, and about half of the total dollar amount spent on transportation. So let's say half of it was on airfare, right? And the other half was whatever, something other than airfare. However, the large majority of US residents who took trips for pleasure in 1997 did not travel by airplane, right? So if you look at the total number of people, the proportion that went by air, that's a small minority. And the large majority did not travel by air. Okay, so let's put everything together. Half the total dollar amount was spent on airfare, and the large majority of US residents who took trips for pleasure in 97 did not travel by airplane. So we're going to say that this half of all transportation expenses on airfare, this came from a small minority of travelers. Quick check, is everyone okay with this summary of the information that's been given to us? Okay, awesome. So the information that we have is pretty straightforward, right? So we've got half of the dollar amount going to airfare and half the dollar amount. And remember, these are just approximate numbers. We don't have exact numbers, but approximately half is going on airfare and approximately half is on non airfare. Now let's come back to option C. Option C says per mile traveled, those who traveled by airplane tended to spend more on transportation to their destination than did those who used other means of transportation. Now, as Karthik correctly pointed out, you can come up with an example in which this is not true, right? And the reason for that is we don't know how many miles the people who've gone by airplane have traveled. We don't know how many miles people who've used other means of transportation have traveled. So, on a per mile basis, what we would need is we would need the denominator to be the total number of miles, right? We don't have that. So, we can't get to this. And remember, this is a must be true question. The correct option must follow from the information we have. And why can't we be sure that C is true? Because we don't have information about the distance traveled. Okay, good. So Karthik has removed C for us. Now let's move on to option D. People who did not travel by airplane had lower average transportation expenses than people who did. How do we get to this one?
So because the airfare or the total expense was same in both the cases,
Mhm.
and number of people was higher by not airplane, so the average for not airplane is lower, right?
Very good. So you have two groups. So let's say X and Y. And X is the small minority, whereas Y is the large majority. And so the size of group X is much smaller than the size of group Y. But both of them account for half the dollar expenditure on transportation. So half the dollar expenditure is coming from a very small group, and half the dollar expenditure is coming from a much larger group. So the average for one of them is going to be higher than the average for the other. Or, as option D puts it, people who did not travel by airplane, so that's the large majority, had lower average transportation expenses than people who did. Good. So Kush has given us the right answer on this. Let's take a quick look at the other options. Option A. Most of those who traveled by airplane did so because the airfare to their destination was lower than the cost of the other available means of transportation. This one's trying to get into the motivation of the people who traveled by airplane. Why did they travel by airplane? We don't know, and we definitely can't be sure about this. In a must be true question, we have to be sure about whatever we're going to mark. So A is out. Option B. Most of those who traveled by airplane did so because other means of transportation to their destinations were unavailable. Again, this is very similar to the previous one. Can we be absolutely sure that the reason they traveled by airplane was that they didn't have any other way to get to their destination? We can't, so we take this one out as well. Now, we've already discussed C and D, so let's move directly to E. Those who traveled by airplane spent about as much on average on other means of transportation as they did on airfare. Okay, so what is this one saying? So we've got the dollar amount, half of it was on air and half of it was on other means of transportation. And in terms of the number of people, the proportion who went by air, that was a small minority, right? Option E is saying those who travel by airplane, so remember the small minority, spent about as much on average on other means of transportation as they did on airfare. So the same group on average spent the same amount of money on other means as they did on airfare. So, in other words, the large majority that did not go by air spent basically nothing. Now, if we go back to the stimulus, right at the beginning, we see this part. Transportation expenses accounted for a large portion of expenditure by US residents in general. So, we can't mark option E because it's basically saying that people who did not go by air, remember, that's the large majority. It's basically saying that they spent nothing on transportation. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Here you go. This is a high difficulty question. Again, 2.5 minutes. Please go ahead. Okay, so that's 2.5 minutes. Now, I'm actually seeing this question after a very long time. So, one of the things that I want to do is I just want to quickly review the stimulus so that I also remember it. Okay, so let's start. Let's go through it together. It says there's a play. So, what's this? La Finestrina. Let's call it LF. Now at Central Theatre. It was written in Italy in the 18th century. Okay, so this is an 18th century play. The director claims that this production is as similar to the original play as is possible. So, as similar as is possible. And then we get another piece of information that says although the actor who plays Harlequin the clown gives a performance very reminiscent of Groucho. Right. Okay, so I remember this one. Let's pause here for a second. The actor who plays Harlequin the clown gives a performance very reminiscent of Groucho Marx. Now, they've told us that Groucho Marx is a 20th century comedian, and B, American. Both of these are different from 18th century and Italy. The director was claiming that this production of La Finestrina was as similar to the 18th century Italian production as possible. But now we're getting some information that seems to contradict or at least weaken that claim. But if we keep reading, so the last part over here, which says Marx's comic style was very much within the comic acting tradition that had begun in 16th century Italy. So even though you had these two things about Groucho Marx that seemed to say that, okay, maybe this is not similar to the old style, what they're effectively telling us is that Groucho Marx's style was within the tradition that had begun in 16th century Italy. Okay, quick check. Have I summarized this correctly? Just let me have a yes on this because, as I said, I haven't seen this question in a long time. Okay, so I think I've got this one right. Now let's take a look at the stem. The considerations given. Now, when you see this, right, the word considerations is typically used to refer to support statements. So, what this saying is that the given considerations would be support for an argument that something. Now, when you say somebody is arguing something, right, basically that means that's the main point that they are pushing for. So, the considerations given best serve as part of an argument that. So, if you were to argue something, you would use the given considerations. Basically, what we're saying over here is we're looking at a conclusion question. Now, before we move ahead, I just want to quickly check if everyone is comfortable with the stem. Okay, excellent. Kush, I see that you've raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Can you please repeat the part of the stem that you explained?
Absolutely. So let's read it together. Something best serves as part of an argument that. So it looks like this. Something serves as part of an argument and then something else. Let's say X serves as part of an argument that Y. So the X part over here is the information that has been given to us. So the given considerations best serve as part of an argument that, and now this is going to be the correct option. Now, let's be clear on this. When somebody says that, he or she is arguing that, what they're basically trying to tell us is that's their conclusion, right? Kush, would you be comfortable saying that if I say Kush argued that something, that would be introducing your main point? Quick check.
Yes, got it.
Perfect. So when we say the considerations given, right, the only thing that we want to add to that is that the word considerations is typically used to mean support. So what they're saying is the given support best serves as part of an argument that something. It's a little weird. That's basically what it's saying. Kush, quick check. Confirmed.
Yep, thank you.
Perfect. Now, in this question, I actually don't remember which options are close. I mean, which ones can be confusing. And come to think of it, I don't think I even remember the correct answer. Quick check. Can someone put the correct answer up over here? Okay, so the correct answer is D. Please check your answers, D for Delta. Now, is there any other option that we felt was close to that? Something that was, tempting? Okay, Karthik is saying C. Karthik, if you're comfortable walking us through C, please go ahead.
Yes, so it in a way implies that the actors' training in the United States in the 20th century is based on the principle that matches from the training of actors in the 18th century Italy. So
Mhm.
that is what it is trying to imply. And that is, something which, if you read the statement superficially, you'll get an idea that yes, because it connects some, dots from 20th century, then 16th century and 18th century play. So somehow, if you just match the words, you'll directly reach to the answer choice C.
Right. So I totally get what you're saying. It seems as if this is something that would be tempting. It would be like a trap option. Now, Karthik's told us why someone may fall for that trap. So now let's turn to removing C. How do we not fall for that trap and take C out? I see Simran has raised her hand. Simran, please go ahead.
So I'd not choose C because the option says is based on the principles that do not differ radically from those that underlay the training of actors in the 18th century Italy. But if you read the passage, it says that Marx's comic style was very much within the comic tradition that had begun in the 16th century Italy. So it seems like his acting did not really match 18th century Italy, and hence I'd not choose C.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. From what I've understood, you're focusing on the difference between 16th and 18th century Italy, right? That's fair, but here's where we need to pay very close attention to the language. Let me go back to the stimulus. So basically, if we think about what the critic is saying, although something something 20th century, Marx's style was very much. So this is the phrase that I'm interested in, very much. Within the tradition that basically began in 16th century Italy. So it began in the 16th century, and the phrase very much. We typically use very much when we want to emphasize something. So it really seems as if the critic thinks that this would be compatible with what the director thinks. So the critic is saying, although the actor gives a performance that reminds us of Groucho Marx, who is a 20th century American comedian, Marx's comic style was very much within the comic acting tradition that had begun in 16th century Italy. So let me put C back up, and I'll tell you why I removed it. I removed it because this option expanded the scope to all actors. The training of all actors in the entire United States. So, what really stood out was that this option suddenly moved to all actors, which just seems extremely weird. Quick check, Simran, is that okay?
Yes, absolutely makes sense. The passage does not really refer to actors per se, it just talks about Marx's comic style.
And yeah, just to be clear, I get what you're saying also. Just keep in mind that this is a conclusion question. So we have to ask ourselves whether the entire argument is set up to get to a conclusion about the training of all 20th century actors in the US. Kush, you've raised your hand. Please go ahead.
So because the stimulus talks about the tradition of the acting, the modern tradition,
Mhm.
doesn't that somehow relate with the training of all the actors or something like that?
Hang on. So, which part are we looking at?
The second line, the director claims that this production is as similar to the original production as is possible in modern theater.
Yeah, but even that will be just for this play, right? It won't be for all actors in the United States,
Makes sense, right?
right? Awesome. Okay, now let's take a quick look at the other options. Yeah, please go ahead, Karthik.
So I was talking about the correct answer choice D. Here,
Mhm.
isn't this, really directly implied? I mean, this comes as a very straightforward answer, isn't it? So, that point that you made initially during this session, that really stuck me in this very question. That this is not something which is contrary to what we find, but this serves as a very simple answer, isn't it?
Could be, but as always, our job becomes much easier with elimination. If we had to select D, let's take a look. The director's claiming that this modern production is as similar to the old style as possible. Then we get a statement that tells us that one of the actors in the play, so in this modern production, gives us a performance that reminds us of a modern actor. And that would weaken the director's claim because the director's claiming that, look, my play is as similar to the old style as possible, but one of his or her actors is actually, giving us a performance that reminds us of a modern actor. But then we get the next statement, which says that this modern actor's style is actually the old style. So at the end of the day, what the critic can say is, look, the modern actor, his style is actually the old style. So this actor who's playing Harlequin the clown, his or her performance doesn't actually weaken the director's claim. Quick check, are we comfortable with that? All right, now this is definitely not an easy question. So let's take a look at the other options as well. Right, the correct answer might even look straightforward, but that's not to say that the question is easy. But as we discussed earlier, let's take a look at the other options. Now, before we get to E, which was Simran's question, let's take a quick look at A and B. A is about what modern audiences can tolerate, but we have absolutely no information about what audiences like and don't like. So, audiences, modern audiences, what they can tolerate, what they can't tolerate, no information on that. So, option A is, I would say, an easy out. What about option B? B says Groucho Marx once performed the part of the character Harlequin in La Finestrina. Again, the critic just says that the performance of the actor who plays Harlequin kind of reminds us of Groucho Marx. But from that statement, we can't conclude that Groucho Marx played the exact same role at some point in his career, right? So option B is out. Now let's get to option E. The director of La Finestrina must have advised the actor who plays Harlequin to model his performance on comic performances of Groucho Marx. Okay, Simran, please go ahead.
Um, so I didn't mark this option, but I just wanted to understand why it's the wrong option. Is it because the option reads that must have advised the actor who plays Harley Quinn to model his performance on the comic performance of Groucho Marx? The passage does not say anything about the director advising the actor. So is that why we are saying that this is wrong because it's technically outside information?
That's absolutely correct. But we will not say it's outside information, we'll just say it's unavailable information.
Right, unavailable.
So, yeah, as in who advised the actor to model his performance on Groucho Marx? We have no idea. We don't even know if any external party advised the actor to model his performance on Groucho Marx. Maybe the actor came up with the idea him or herself, right?
Right, makes sense.
So, yeah, from the information given, we can't get to option E. Awesome. So, yeah, it was nice to see this question again. The next question will also be a high difficulty question. Please go ahead. Okay, so that's 2.5 minutes. First, please check your answers. The correct answer is A for alpha. And I think the option that many people end up marking is option D, the fourth option. So, what I would like from your side is why A is correct, and then we'll move on to why D is wrong. And then, of course, we can take the other options as well. Whenever you're ready, please let me know.
Ajitesh, may I?
Absolutely, please go ahead.
Yes. So, in option choice A, what it really tries to conclude is, for example, if I get an excerpt from a book in my magazine that I read, and that is the only part, which I was really interested to read, I would not go ahead and buy the book. But the statement, the question stimulus states clearly that it includes an increase in sales. So the point is that that excerpt that I read should stimulate an interest in me to read that book completely. So that is where the option choice A really makes it correct.
Right. And we're just going to add one thing to that. The number of people like you who have that interest, that number should be more than the number of people who lose interest. Let's take another look at the stimulus. As Karthik pointed out, in the stimulus, we are basically told that the benefits of this strategy include two things: an increase in sales, and really to drive the point home, they've also included this word sure. It's a sure increase in sales. So they're saying the benefits of such excerption include not only a sure increase in sales, right? So basically, what they're saying is if you put a small part of your book in a magazine, in a high circulation magazine, you will get a sure increase in sales. You will also get a fee paid by the magazine to the book's publisher. But the main point is that there's a sure increase in sales. Now let's come back to A. And what Karthik was telling us is if you read that small part of a book and you realize, okay, this seems interesting, let's go buy it. And somebody else says, okay, yeah, I've read a small part of the book, I've got it, or I find it boring, or I've fully understood everything that they have to say. I don't need the entire book now. So they end up not buying the book. We need the number of these people, the ones who got turned off, to be less than the number of people who did decide to purchase the book. That's how we'll get a sure increase in sales. So, yeah, these would be the people who would be like, yeah, I've read part of it. Why do I need to read the whole thing? That number is smaller than the number who actually, for whom, the excerpt stimulates a desire to read the book. So, the people who end up buying the book and the people who end up deciding not to buy the book, that number must be in favor of buying the book so that we can get a sure increase in sales. Quick check, is everyone comfortable with why A is correct? Let me have a yes if we're sure about this. Okay, I've received a few yeses. Excellent. Now, from my side, I want to see how you guys approached D. But first, let me take out options B and C. B says, because the financial advantage of accepting a new book in a magazine usually accrues to the book's publisher, magazine editors are unwilling to publish excerpts from new books. But we don't have any information to say that magazine editors are unwilling to put excerpts of new books in their magazines. At the end of the day, we know that they do it. Exactly how willingly they do this, we have no idea. So option B is out. Option C. In calculating the total number of copies that a book has sold, publishers include sales of copies of magazines that featured an excerpt of the book. This is completely random. You know what it's telling us? It's telling us that let's say there's a high circulation magazine whose circulation is 1 million. This option is saying that in calculating the total number of copies that your book has sold, publishers include sales of the magazine also, in which the excerpt was put. So, if your book has sold like 1,000 copies, publishers would report that as 1,000 plus 1 million. Again, the information that we have doesn't let us get to option C. Now let's move to option D. This is the one that I want you guys on. Please let me know. How do we take option D out? Why do we take it out?
So, Ajitesh, here it is essentially, understanding the meaning of the term effectiveness. So, for a publisher, the effectiveness would be that he publishes in a magazine which is widely circulated, and people then go on to buy that book, right? So, that is something which is not guaranteed here, because it may be the case that a lot of people do not find that book good enough, and the ultimately the number of the sales will in fact drop as compared to if he would have not published it in the magazine. So, can we say so? That's also a scenario which we need to consider.
So we may have to consider it, but what we can also do is we can take a look at, let's say, what is going on or what the person who wrote this option might have been thinking. Now, remember the information that we were given. What was the effective form of publicity? To have excerpts of it published in a high circulation magazine soon after the book is published. So if you got a new book, you put an excerpt of the new book in a high circulation magazine soon after the book is published. That's one of the more effective kinds of publicity. Agreed?
Right.
Now, from this information, can we say that if you publish it in any magazine, not just a high circulation magazine, that you will get a benefit?
Yes.
No.
If no, that is what I'm coming to. If
Mhm.
it means a short increase in the sales, then yes, but that is something which is not guaranteed.
No. Hang on. Go back to the information. Among the more effective kinds of publicity that publishers can get for a new book is to have excerpts of it published in a high circulation magazine. The benefits of such excerption, right? So when they say such excerption, what type are they talking about? To have the excerpt published in a high circulation magazine, right?
Right.
So, the benefit of this kind of strategy is a sure increase in sales. Now, what this means is we cannot say that I'll put my excerpt in any magazine and it might be a low circulation magazine, but I'll get a benefit, even if it's a proportionally smaller benefit. We can't say that. For all we know, and again, I don't know, but for all we know, if you put it in a low circulation magazine or a medium circulation magazine, you will get zero benefit. Not proportional, you may get zero benefit, or you may get negative benefit. Option D, option D is saying effectiveness measured in terms of increased sales of a book is proportional to the circulation of the magazine, which means no matter what magazine you take, whether it's high circulation, low circulation, medium circulation, you will see that the effectiveness is proportional to that circulation. So, effectively, sales will be proportional to circulation. But really, we don't know this. All we know is that if you put it in a high circulation magazine soon after the book is published, you'll get a sure increase in sales. But whether there's a proportional relationship between sales and circulation, that's too much of a stretch.
Yes. Got it.
Right? Excellent. All right, let's take a look at option E, books that Simran, I see you've unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So would D be correct if it read is proportional to the circulation of high circulation magazine?
Interesting, but probably not. All we know is that it's a good form of publicity to put your excerpt in a high circulation magazine. Now, even within high circulation magazines, do you get a proportional relationship? Like, do you get extra benefit if it's like a higher circulation magazine? We just don't have that information,
Right.
right? Awesome.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's get back to E. Books that are suitable for excerpting in high circulation magazines sell more copies than books that are not suitable for excerpting. So this one is very, it's one of those random options. It says that if you have a book which you can create an excerpt of, remember, an excerpt is just like a small part of your book. Kush, you've raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Can we say that option E reverses implication?
No, we would say that it's a completely unpredictable, random kind of thing. And why is that? Because the information that we have doesn't tell us anything about books that are not suitable for excerpting. Let me give you an example, and this is my favorite example for E. What are the two books that have sold the most copies? I think it's something we don't normally think about, but it's actually the Bible and the Quran. Now, let's say that these two books are not suitable for excerpting. Now, what option E is saying is books that are suitable for excerpting in high circulation magazines sell more copies than books that are not suitable for excerpting, which is very strange because we literally have no information about these other types of books. All we can say is these types of books will get some sort of benefit. That is, if their sales without the strategy would have been X, we will get something that is more than X. But whether as a group these types of books will sell more than books that cannot be excerpted, that's just completely not supported by the information that we have. Okay, quick check. Is everyone comfortable with this? Why E is out? Okay, perfect. I've received 3 or 4 yeses. Now let's take a look at yeah. This is another high difficulty question, and it's a very good question. Please go ahead. 2.5 minutes. Okay, that's 2.5 minutes. First of all, please check your answers. The correct answer is option D, D for Delta. Now, before we get into these options, let's take a look at the information that we've been given. So there's a country, let's call it M, and there's another country, let's call it G. Now, what does G seem to do? G seems to be keeping its GNP a state secret. So they don't release this data, apparently. And what has M been doing every year since 1963? So maybe including 1963, maybe after 1963? But every year since 1963, M has been trying to project what G's GNP will be 5 years from now. So they've been doing that since 1963. So we'll say that these are projections of the GNP. And what have they also been doing? They've also been trying to estimate the GNP for the previous year. So they've got estimates, and these are for the previous year, right? And they've been doing this also every year. Now, the review in 1994 revealed that these were very accurate. So let's put a small tick mark over here. The estimates are very accurate. I mean, it doesn't mean that they're exact, but they're quite accurate. Now, the review also showed that all these projections were serious underestimates. So, major underestimates. Now, what we can say for sure from this information is there's going to be a gap between the projections and the estimates. Because the first one, the projections are serious underestimates, whereas the second one, the minus 1 year estimates are actually quite precise. So clearly, there's going to be a difference between these two numbers. And there's going to be a big difference because the projections were serious underestimates. Quick check, would everyone agree that they would have seen that there's a big difference between these numbers, year after year? From 1969 onwards, yes, I think that's correct, depending on what they mean by since. 5 years after that would be 1968 or 1969 onwards. Karthik, is that what you were asking? I think it makes sense.
Yes, so Ajitesh, what I was trying to understand was that the first
Mhm.
projection they started making was in 1963, so that would have been for 1968.
Correct.
So there was no projection made for 1964 to 1967. So in 1969 they would have again made a projection of the previous year for 1968, and then they would have matched the values, right?
That's right.
Okay.
But just keep in mind that the projections are forward looking. It's the estimates that are for 1 year ago. And all of this would have been done till whatever, 1994 or whatever.
Right. Okay.
Awesome. The stem is pretty straightforward. Of the following claims, which is most strongly supported by the statements given? Option A, Goro's GNP fluctuated greatly. This is not going to be correct, primarily because we just know that there was a difference between the estimate and the projection. Now, the difference could have been a constant for all we know. Option B, prior to 1995, Goro had not released data intended to mislead. Again, this is whether country G had released data or not. We have no idea about this because the information is not given. Maybe they had released data, maybe they had not released data, maybe they had released misleading data, maybe they hadn't. So, option B is also out. Option C, the amount by which the agency underestimated the GNP projected tended to increase over time. Now, the information that we have just tells us this much, that it was a serious underestimate every time. But did that underestimate tend to get worse over time? Again, this is not information that we have, so we can't say this. Okay, that brings us to option D, the correct answer. Now, I'm going to ask you guys why option D is correct. But first, let me just get a quick check. Are you okay with why the first three options are out? Okay, good. But this is definitely a high difficulty question. Let's take our time. Let's be absolutely sure about option D. Whenever you're ready, let me know.
So I would take an example for this. For the 1968, the first projection after 5 years will be for 1968, and we also have another projection for 1968 in year 1969, right? So there's some difference between these two, right? As pointed out in the stimulus. And then again, for the year 1970, we will have two projections, and there will be difference between these two. So the agency will keep observing these differences that they made 5 years prior and 1 year after the current year, after the projected year, right? And then they might say that, I mean, they will obviously infer that there were some inaccuracies in their 5 year projections.
Good. Now, I'm just going to extend that slightly. So, what you said is absolutely spot on. Basically, what Kush pointed out is that these differences, right, they will have noticed them every year, like after the first 5 years or so. So, starting maybe in 1969, they would have started noticing these differences. Now, sometimes students ask me, but the review happened in 1994. So, how do we know that the projection was a problem and not the estimate? That's what we're going to discuss now. Option D says even before the new information came to light, the agency had reason to think that at least some of the 5 year projections it had made were inaccurate. Now, why is this? See, if you have two variables, right, like x and y, now x might be correct, y might be correct, or x might be wrong, y may be correct, or x may be correct, y may be wrong, or both of them may be wrong. Now, because these numbers are different from each other, we can rule the first possibility out. That is, they can't both be correct. Now we come to the slightly harder question. Maybe both these numbers are wrong, or maybe the first one is wrong and the second one is right, or the first one is right and the second one is wrong. This is where we need to put a little bit of extra thought into this. So remember, the first number is a 5 year projection into the future, right? It's a projection. Whereas the second number is an estimate, and it's an estimate of the past year. So the word past is important. Now, I want you to weigh these two things. Which one would you have more faith in? Something that's 5 years away in the future, or something that's only 1 year away and it's something in the past? Quick check. Okay, Kush is saying past year, Shohini is saying past one, right? So I think we're thinking along the right lines over here. Your estimate of something that's already happened, especially if it's just 1 year ago, right, is going to be far more reliable than a projection of something in the future, especially one that is 5 years into the future. So, if the numbers are different from each other, the agency is more likely to think that the estimates are more reliable than the projections. That's why it's reasonably okay to say that they would have some reason to think that at least some of the 5 year projections were inaccurate. Quick check, is everyone okay with D? Just give me a yes. Or, of course, unmute if you're not sure. Okay, I think I've received 2 or 3 yeses. Perfect. Now let's take a look at option E. The agency's 5 year projections of Goro's GNP had no impact on economic planning in M. Now, again, this is one of those unpredictable random options that just, there's no support for. So, whether they had an impact on economic planning or not, absolutely no idea, right? So, just to give you a bit of background on this question, although this is a high difficulty question, sometimes what people do is they solve it through elimination. Now, the point where most people get stuck is option D. Some of them think that, yeah, there is support for option D, but I can't be 100% sure about it. So let me remove it. In fact, let me just do a quick check. Did anybody struggle with that you did not want to mark option D? Okay, so we didn't face any issues with this. Fair enough. That's great. It means that you are sticking to your task, which is to mark the best of the 5 options, and not worry about whether the option is like super watertight. Okay, awesome. Quick check. Let me have a yes if you're ready to move on to the last question for the day. Fair enough, Shohini. So I think we may be able to finish the last question. Please go ahead. 2.5 minutes. All right, guys, that's 2.5 minutes. Now, first of all, please check your answers. The correct answer is option C. Now, in this question, again, it's quite a difficult question, but let's go through this step by step. The information that we have is basically this much. If there are fewer restrictions, there are more lawyers who advertise. So, if there are fewer restrictions, there are more lawyers who advertise. Now, they've also told us that there is a specific restriction, right? So, there is a restriction on against advertisements that do not specify fee arrangements. So, let's call this R restriction for specifying fee arrangements, right? So, we have that information as well, that this is an example of a restriction. Now, let's take a look at the question stem. If the statements above are true, which of the following must be true? This is another one of those must be true questions. We have to be very strict over here. Let's take a look at the correct answer first. If the restriction against advertisements that do not specify fee arrangements is removed, more lawyers will advertise their services. Now, this is what I mean when I say that the correct option may seem simple. Again, I think, as Karthik pointed out earlier, simple, not easy. So, to get to this option, remember the beginning, they told us that the fewer the restrictions, the more lawyers who advertise. And they also told us that we had this restriction on specifying fee arrangements. So, because this is a restriction, if you remove it, what you're effectively doing is you're reducing the number of restrictions. And according to the information that we have in the question, that's going to lead to an increase in the number of lawyers who advertise their services. So, effectively, what option C is saying is if you remove one restriction, that is, the restriction against advertisements that do not specify fee arrangements, then more lawyers will advertise their services. So, on the basis of the information that we have, is it safe to say that option C is a good option to mark? Let me know if you're comfortable with C. Okay, I've received multiple yeses. Perfect. Now let's take a look at some of the other options. Option A says some lawyers who now advertise will charge more for specific services if they don't have to specify fee arrangements in the advertisements. Again, absolutely no way to get to this. So, whether lawyers will suddenly start charging more or not, if they don't have to specify fee arrangements, we have no information on this. I mean, they may do it, but we can't say that this must be true. Option B, more consumers will use legal services if there are fewer restrictions on advertising. Again, this is not something that we can say for sure. Remember that even if you try to somehow link more consumers using legal services to lower prices, remember that this is a must be true question. What option B says may be true, but we can't say that this must be true on the basis of the information that we have. What about option D? If more lawyers advertise lower prices for specific services, some lawyers who don't advertise will also charge less. I mean, the behavior of lawyers who don't advertise, we can't get to this. And finally, option E. If the only restrictions on the advertising of legal services were those that apply to every type of advertising, most lawyers would advertise their services. There's just so much going on in this option about most lawyers, about restrictions on advertising, applying to every type of advertising. This information, this statement, again, we don't have information to support this, so we can't say that it must be true. Now, we went through this question very quickly. Karthik, please go ahead.
Yes. So, Ajitesh, if I go through the stimulus, the statement one says, if fewer restrictions, then more lawyers advertise. So, isn't statement C simply a rephrased version of the statement above?
No, it's not a simple restatement. So remember, there are two statements that we're putting together. So generally, we know that if R decreases, then LA increases.
Yes.
And the second statement that we're using is that R SFA is an R,
Right.
right? So there is something that is a restriction. And therefore, we're saying if we remove this restriction, then LA will go up. It's not exactly the same.
Right. So how I am interpreting is this way, that fewer restrictions mean no restrictions or very few restrictions.
No, fewer just means a smaller number.
Okay.
So in the beginning, they would have said, let's go back to the stimulus. The fewer restrictions there are on the advertising of legal services, the more lawyers there are who advertise their services. So all of this just means as the number of restrictions goes down, the number of lawyers who advertise, that number increases.
Okay. Okay.
Right? So inversely proportional.
Fine.
Awesome. All right. So quick check. Is everyone comfortable with this question? Give me a yes, or if you have doubts, please unmute. Okay, excellent. Shohini, will we have a class on the 31st? No, Shohini, I would not ask my students to drop in on the 31st of December for a class. I would not do that to you. So, yeah, the next session will be in Jan. Okay, thank you all so much for attending this session. I hope that you enjoy conclusion questions, even if they're not super common. And I will see you guys in the next session in the new year for Evaluate and Paradox. You're welcome, Kush. Have a great day. You're welcome, Karthik. Have a great day.
Thank you, Ajitesh. Thank you.
You're welcome, Amit. You're welcome, Simran. Shohini. Happy New Year. Yes. Happy New Year, everybody. See you in Jan, Simran. Happy New Year, Shohini.